When discussing the matter of Nazi strategic mistakes, the conversation often becomes one of alternate history, where bold declarations such as, if Hitler had only a few more X, Y's or Z's or done A, B, and C, would all be speaking German right now. Now, we don't think such conversations are really that useful, so today, when we dive into discussing the matter ourselves, we're going to keep things very much grounded in reality, focusing on what did actually happen and why, rather than worrying about how things might have played out had they gone differently. There's also a lot of different mistakes for us to point to, far more than we could ever cover in this channel's format, so don't consider this as anything like a ranked or all-encompassing list, but rather as a glimpse into the topic by way of the blunders that we happen to find the most interesting. Germany's strategic situation looked rosy indeed come the end of July 1940. France had fallen on the 22nd of that month, Norway had been conquered the month prior, both Belgium and the Netherlands had been brought under the jackboot in May, and Denmark had capitulated in April, and that's not even a full list of the countries Germany conquered around that time. Seemingly then, all that had to be done next was to pop over the English Channel, let the British have their turn at receiving a right and proper shoeing, and then World War II could be called a victory for Germany and its allied Axis powers. And while plans for exactly how to do that varied enormously week by week, they all had one thing in common. The Royal Air Force had to be utterly decimated, as aerial superiority would be absolutely vital in whatever form Operation Sea Lion, the German codename for the coming invasion of the British mainland, would take. And so it was that the Battle of Britain began on the 11th of July. Unfortunately for Hitler, however, and very fortunately for all of us today, he and his forces ended up making a right pig's ear of it, with the battle ending with a German defeat on the 31st of October, in no small part due to their massive underestimation of the RAF's capabilities. Oftentimes, this underestimation was the result of garbage intelligence work, with figures such as Joseph Schmidt, a sycophantic and incompetent senior intelligence officer under Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering, constantly relaying what his boss wanted to hear, rather than the reality of the situation as it was. According to him, the RAF was always one more raid away from running out of fighters and throwing the towel in, and the British populace was always just about to bash down the doors of number 10 and demand a surrender in the face of the Luftwaffe's onslaught. None of those things were ever true, however, and so an unending routine of, we'll go all in on this one just to finish them off, sure we'll take heavy losses, but it'll be worth it if it wins us the war began, and that, naturally, wasn't very sustainable long term. And if you're wondering why Goering never caught on to this, the answer to that would be drugs. As come 1940, he was more morphine than man, which, shocking, we know, didn't exactly do wonders for keeping him logical and level-headed. Further to bad intelligence, however, the Luftwaffe also completely failed to fully appreciate just how good Britain's Dowding system was, the first integrated air defense network. Overseen by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, it combined radar stations, ground-based observers, and an advanced communication network to provide real-time information on incoming enemy aircraft, allowing the RAF to intercept 90% of total raids, with some specific smaller periods even managing to reach a full 100% interception rate. For context, before the Dowding system was constructed, a rate of 30 to 50% was considered really, really good. The Luftwaffe knew it existed, make no mistake about that. They just vastly underestimated its capabilities, which led to some efforts here and there to bomb radar stations with a view to blinding the Dowding system, but such efforts are half-hearted, few and far between, and just ineffective, with the RAF going above and beyond to make sure any damaged installations were back up and running ASAP, oftentimes before the next raid. Operationally, the Luftwaffe also struggled with logistical and resource constraints. The Messerschmitt 109, for example, its formidable primary fighter aircraft, had a very limited range. Operating from bases in France, it barely had the endurance to reach targets over southern England and engage in combat before having to return. This left German bombers vulnerable to RAF interceptions, as they frequently had to complete missions without adequate fighter cover. They did also have the Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine escort fighter that should have been perfect for this, however, but while it had the endurance to do the job, it was woeful in combat against the nimbler Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes that it came up against, so it was no good either. The Germans also royally messed up when they shifted their focus from bombing RAF airfields to bombing cities on the 6th of September, beginning with an attack on London the following day. For the RAF, this was an absolute dream come true, as it massively took the pressure off of them and allowed them to operate their defensive sorties and indeed their own attacks on Germany and its occupied territories far easier and far more often. It gets worse too, because we can't even say that this decision was one that was happened upon by logic and reasoning, or with some sort of thinking along the lines of, well, bomb the population so they'll demand surrender. Instead, it was a purely emotional one, with Hitler and his chums simply wanting revenge for the British bombing their cities, which they'd begun doing in August. Ultimately, it is all but impossible for us to overstate just how much of a blunder losing the Battle of Britain was, as not only had their defeat cost them 1,977 precious aircraft, but far more devastating than that, Britain was still there, sat on the coast of its occupied territories, ready and waiting to act as a 243,000 square kilometer staging post for when the time came to invade Nazi territory, something that would have been flatly impossible otherwise. Germany never had enough oil during the war. Partly this was due to the fact that they simply didn't have any meaningful deposits of the stuff within their borders, but it was also because their efforts to find alternate sources were just pretty lackluster. For example, Germany imported vast quantities of oil from Romania, which was both an Axis power and Europe's largest oil producer, with peak years seeing upwards of 13 million barrels imported, which is nearly half of Romania's entire output. Similarly, Germany also had a huge drive towards coal liquefaction, an industrial process that takes coal, of which Germany had plenty, and turns it into oil. And yet, these efforts still were not enough, and from day zero, fuel shortages threatened to cripple the Nazi war machine. It is one of the very things that led to the adoption of blitzkrieg tactics, in fact, because Hitler's generals knew that once their strategic reserves ran dry, their whole strategic situation would be severely hampered. And so, when they went into the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and it didn't end up being another quick and easy victory, this naturally made their oil situation really rather dire, as it was then a war of attrition, and the Soviets alone were producing a lot more of the black stuff than the entire Axis bloc combined. Now, with that in mind, as 1941 became 1942, a decision was made to push down into the Caucasus, the USSR's key oil-producing region, and seize it for themselves. A double whammy decision that would not only massively boost Germany's supplies, but also deny the Soviets theirs. It became part of Operation Case Blue, Army Group South's offensive plans for mid-1942, and it commenced in June. Initially, things went well, with Army Group A, the half of the Army Group South that was tasked with advancing on the Caucasus, advancing upwards of 800 miles into the USSR's borders, capturing the city of Maikop and all of the oil fields around it by August. Keep up that momentum, it was reasoned, and they'd soon enough have taken the Caucasus completely. That initial success masked a dire problem, however, because 800 miles is a really, really long supply line, and the Germans simply weren't up to the task of maintaining such a thing. In fairness, they'd have struggled even at the best of times, but with Army Group B, the other half of Army Group South, also beginning its enormous assault upon Stalingrad in July 1942, they were simply overstretched to breaking point. And that's before you even get to the fact that Army Group North was also nearly a year into the meat grinder that was the siege of Leningrad, and Army Group Center was barely holding together following its botched assault on Moscow. All things that had vast logistical requirements of their own. It didn't help that the lands they did take proved absolutely useless too, as the Soviets, being fully aware of the stakes here, had gone full scorched earth on their land before they retreated, correctly reasoning that it was far better that no one have it than their enemies have it. As a result, the Germans rolled into Maikop to find the oil wells ablaze and totally out of action for the foreseeable future. Come the peak of Operation Case Blue's advance, which saw them reach the outskirts of Grozny, the German forces were exhausted, starving, and were so short of fuel that their logistics were being operated mostly by old-school horses and wagons. The few drops of oil they did have were reserved for the panzers, in the vain hope that with just one more slight push, it'd all come together. But alas, it did not, and come October, Hitler, recognizing the disaster, ordered Army Group A to take on a defensive stance and hold what they'd already taken. This massively stretched the German lines and gobbled up precious manpower that was direly needed in Stalingrad, all just to hold a bunch of inoperable oil fields. The whole sorry affair was nothing short of an abject disaster, and a pointless one at that. And what's worse, the execution of this wasted operation had cost Germany 200,000 casualties, and its allied partners of Romania, Italy, Hungary, and Slovakia a further 150,000 casualties between them. The Nazi war machine also made a deadly mistake when it failed to make full use of the potential allies that it had within its occupied Soviet territories. You see, the Soviet Union was a regime despised by many of its own people. Years of terror under Stalin had created deep resentment, with millions of Ukrainians, Balts, and Russians having suffered through collectivization, political purges, the suppression of religion, mass deportations, and forced famines. For the Ukrainians, that last point in particular was one which really struck a nerve, as between 1932 and 1933, they had to endure an engineered famine that became known as the Holodomor, during which time upwards of 5 million of them perished. So horrific was the Holodomor, in fact, that to many today it is considered a genocide, with that view being taken by 34 UN member states and plenty of historians. As a result of that, many Soviet citizens welcomed the Germans as liberators when the panzers first rolled into their towns. So enthusiastic were they, in fact, that many fully threw their lot in with the Nazis and joined either the SS or the Wehrmacht, with an estimated 1 million Russians, 250,000 Ukrainians, 100,000 Estonians, 50,000 Belarusians, and 30,000 Lithuanians all turncoating and volunteering to fight for Germany instead. This was just the beginning of things, though, and if the Germans were good to the people in their conquered Soviet lands and hammed up the anti-Soviet messaging a bit, there was a real chance for them to build a truly staggering base of auxiliary manpower. One small problem with that, however, well, Nazism had that whole, Lebensraum in the east for Germans to expand into, and Slavs are subhumans who need to be exterminated to free up room for said expansion. Well, yeah, those attitudes led to Germany totally squandering the golden opportunity it had been handed, with the hope of liberation quickly turning into a reality of occupation, exploitation, and cruelty. This drove potential allies back into the arms of the Soviet regime, which they hated, but that at least appeared to be the lesser of two evils. And to put into context just how devastating the Nazis were to their occupied Soviet territories, consider this as a snapshot. In just the Belarusian SSR alone, 2 million people, or a quarter of its population, had been killed by the time the Nazis were pushed out in 1944. Many top Nazis, if only from a pragmatic perspective if nothing else, recognized how monumentally stupid that this decision was, and they urged for restraint with the Slavs, at least for now, so that their potentially enthusiastic labor could be better exploited. A notable example is none other than Alfred Rosenberg, the leader of the Nazi Office of Foreign Affairs, member of the occupied Eastern Territories, and one of the regime's top racial theorists. He said that the Einsatzgruppen death squads should be explicitly ordered not to target Slavs, a few material gestures should be made to improve their material conditions, and they should dangle the prospect of independent statehood, or at least puppet statehood, akin to Slovakia's, in front of them, so that they could keep the ball rolling and get many, many millions of Slavs into German uniforms enthusiastically. Then, when the war was over, they could drop the ruse and set about reducing their population. Hitler was having none of such talk, though his ego simply would not allow it, and so he willingly passed up on potentially millions of extra soldiers just so that he could chest beat about how big and supposedly clever his ideology was, and instead those who had already volunteered or continued to be press-ganged into service were only able to be used in unarmed laboring roles or in very select combat roles, usually well out of the way of anything too important. We stress usually too, because a few select Slavic formations who somehow maintained their enthusiasm for National Socialism, people are complicated, what can we say, did fight as regular units and also committed their own atrocities to boot, with a notable example being the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, which fought extensively with the 1st Panzer Army late in the war and also killed up to 1,200 civilians in the Huta Pianatska massacre of February 1944. And if you want more evidence that underutilizing Soviet manpower was a giant blunder, consider the fact that other foreign divisions were among some of the most ardent and loyal fighters that the Third Reich ever had, with the 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne, a French formation, being both one of the last units to retreat from the Führer bunker and one of the last units to surrender, period. How many more soldiers like that could Hitler have had if he was willing to shelve his ridiculous ideology and just think a bit more pragmatically? You might assume that total war, that being an economic footing in which every facet of a society is mobilized and militarized for a war effort, was how the Nazis did things from day one, or at least from very early on in the war, when it became apparent that victory wasn't going to be quick coming for them, if it came at all. But, in fact, that's not the case at all. They were remarkably late in accepting the policy, and this is yet another huge mistake. They had already made efforts to increase war production, do note, as exemplified by the fact that in 1936 the 4-year plan was initiated under Goering, with the goal of achieving self-sufficiency in key industries so that Germany was less vulnerable to blockade and embargo, and also just generally increasing armament production more broadly. But moves such as that were mere economic fettling around the edges of things. They were a far cry from total war. In total war sees every economic concern in the nation, from a local blacksmith to a giant conglomerate, only focusing on making stuff for the war. Largely, this stagnation was the product of arrogance, as even after Operation Barbarossa failed to produce a quick victory in the Soviet Union and meat grinders such as Leningrad and Stalingrad began to play out with a vengeance, many Nazi elites were still riding high off the false sense of security that their early victories in Poland, France, and elsewhere had created, and they refused to accept the situation they now found themselves in. This delayed the implementation of total war. Some, however, did see the writing on the wall, chief among which was Joseph Goebbels, who began lobbying Hitler to implement the policy from March 1942. Outwardly, Hitler made all the right noises to make Goebbels happy, and yet total war did not come. From there, with Goebbels being a vocal advocate, a small cohort of like-minded individuals began to form around him, with notable names including Armaments Minister Albert Speer, Economics Minister Volker Funk, and Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front. Together, they began to lobby Hitler, hoping that their combined voices would form a greater volume than the sum of their parts. It took until the new year for them to finally get through to Hitler, who returned from his Christmas break with a genuine enthusiasm for the idea that he had never had before, even instructing Martin Bormann, his personal secretary, to begin discussing the idea with its most vocal advocates, with a view of drafting an appropriate decree to see it implemented. This stage didn't take long, at least, and Hitler had it drafted and signed by the 13th of January 1943. That was almost a whole year after Goebbels had first brought the idea to him. As for what the decree did, it wasn't actually that much, as all it did was establish a steering committee made up of Bormann and Lammers, as well as General Wilhelm Keitel, while Goebbels and Speer served as advisors. And being a committee, it did as committees do, which is to say, a bit, but it was really inefficient as it did that bit. Goebbels, for his part, was furious that he had been sidelined for implementing the very idea that he was the chief proponent of, with him only really being allowed to announce the policy publicly in his infamous Sportpalast speech on the 18th of February and give his opinion when it was asked for, which wasn't very often. Eventually, with the steering committee failing to live up to expectations, Hitler circumvented everything he had put in place and created the Reich Plenipotentiary for Total War on the 23rd of July 1944, at the lead of which he placed Goebbels. This was exactly what should have been done from the outset. One guy, no red tape, and the power to go running around about factories with absolute authority to tell them what to do. And Goebbels was nothing short of exceptional in this role, which he had coveted for so long. Have you ever looked at Nazi economic data and wondered how production across the board seemed to absolutely skyrocket in 1944 when they'd lost so much territory, and that which they did have was getting routinely bombed into absolute buggery? Well, Goebbels and his efforts was how. For those of you who haven't looked at it before, here's a tidbit to give you an idea. This, the Panzer IV, Germany's go-to tank of the war, and one of the few that was in production throughout the entire conflict, had its yearly production climb from 994 in 1942 to 2,983 in 1943 when the steering committee began implementing some changes. It then went up to 3,125 in 1944 when Goebbels held the reins. And remember, Germany's military situation was dire come 1944, and it was losing territories and the factories on them, so that degree of improvement is nothing short of incredible, all things considered. And with improvements like that, can you even begin to imagine how monstrous the German economy could have been had total war been implemented in 1940, when it was more than just rubble where Germany once stood, and indeed, with Germany controlling almost an entire continent?